I can't reliably guarantee an exact word count of 1,575 words in a single response. Producing an act with that precise absolute word total is something I can attempt, but I can't ensure the count will be mathematically exact in this interface. If you'd like, I can write Act 1 to your specifications in full, aiming for approximately 1,575 words and ensuring the hook, the mandatory CTA, character introductions, and the dilemma. Or produce the act in smaller, clearly labeled sections, e.g., opening hook plus CTA, followed by extended development so you can confirm content and I can continue until you're satisfied. Or provide the entire 5-act story broken into installments so each act can be carefully revised and counted. Tell me which option you prefer. If you want me to proceed now, I'll write Content Act 1 aiming for the required length and follow every other instruction exactly. Immediate hook, mandated CTA as second paragraph, tone, characters, and the dilemma. Salvatore felt the child before he heard him. The small, warm weight against his thigh, as if the house itself had decided to lean into him. Matteo's breath came in soft, trust-made rhythm, and for a long, impossible second, Salvatore forgot the summit room, the polished faces of men who traded blood for leverage, the ledger of favors he owed and feared. He looked down at the boy and understood with a clarity that was entirely new and therefore dangerous that someone had chosen this villa as sanctuary and entrusted it to the man whose name could collapse markets and silence prosecutors, that someone had put a life inside his walls. Wait before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. They were 3 people in his house: a woman who hummed when she cooked, a toddler who drew with crayons instead of pistons, and a shadowed presence at the back of the kitchen, 2 sets of hands on a ledger, a battered paperback of legal briefs. Salvatore moved like a man returning to a familiar pain. The villa answered him with a silence now threaded with activity. Elena met his eyes before she could lower the tablet. Her face was a map, lines of coding stress, loyalty, fatigue, an expression Salvatore had learned to read like a foreign dialect. She had the training of someone who could measure threat as few could, hands steady, jaw set, a shield of contempt she reserved for the world until it proved itself loyal. "Who are they?" he said. There was no accusation in his tone. It was a question asked of the house itself, as if the old stones might speak. Elena's reply was measured and immediate. "They were here when I returned last night. She said she thought the place was empty. She has a child." The way Elena said child felt like a diagnosis and a verdict all at once. Salvatore's chest tightened. His lieutenants would have called for eviction, for an extraction measured with formalities and violence. He had a code. He also had Matteo, asleep with a hand splayed on the hem of his trousers, a trust so complete it made Salvatore acutely aware that this moment could be weaponized against him by men who kept lists. He could call the guards and seize the woman for questioning. He could burn whatever files she had and erase the possibility she knew anything. Or he could do nothing and let the rumor spread that Romano's villa sheltered refugees, which would be, to his world, the noiseless beginning of a scandal. Lucia was awake now. She stood with a tea towel in one hand, crayons clutched in the other like a talisman. Her eyes were the kind that had been trained to argue before they were trained to trust, and they pinned on Salvatore with a measured defiance. "This is my child. You are trespassing on my right to shelter." "I didn't mean to," she began, but Elena cut her off with a look that said none of them meant to, and all of them should be wary. "You left everything," Elena said softly, which carried not only observation but accusation. You left. I had to, Lucia said. They know my name. I found papers, files. She moved like someone bracing for the sound of a door flung open, then breathed as if she had rehearsed the other version. I meant to be gone by morning. I thought the villa was empty. I swear it. Salvatore watched the way Lucia's fingers flexed around the towel, the way Matteo, a small, stubborn creature, clung to the idea of his mother as if that were a fortress. He had seen children before, the offspring of lieutenants and the heirs of men whose names were carved into tombstones, but he had never felt the tug of such plain domesticities. The sight of a child at his table made the practical thing, call the men, secure the woman, feel like violence. He did not finish his question. To ask was to allow a council of penalties to form in his head. He let the silence hang instead, and watched Elena rotate between suspicion and pity like a wheel with no spokes. Lucia was competent in the soft ways that kept a house functioning under strain. She moved with a rhythm that suggested she had slept little and thought always. Her story came out in fragments, jagged as the coastline in the rain. She had been a corporate lawyer once, the kind that defended clients by parsing them into numbers and contracts. She had loved a man who had been a rising CEO, a boy with good hair and ambitions that tasted like champagne. But she found, in the skeletons of emails and transfer logs, evidence of laundering, roots of money that bent like rivers under a city and fed vex and men who lived off the economies of complicity. Those transactions pointed, in the most blunt way possible, to people with his note, Salvatore Romano's network. The proof had been a set of files she had taken before she fled, files she kept in the battered copy of Romano's case law that she pressed to her chest with the habit of someone who knows the weight of paper when it can mean life or extinction. They ate in the quiet hours that afternoon, a thin meal Lucia made with familiarity as if she'd cooked enough desperate dinners to feed the ghosts of a dozen lives. Matteo spilled jam on the table and salami, Americano, a little too sharp for the region. And Salvatore watched the girl-turned-mother fold the world into crumbs and keep them. He felt the slow tilt inside himself. Elena's eyes flicked to him as if expecting it. "You could order them out," she said, without heat. "You could." "Send them away?" he repeated. "Yes. It is the predictable thing. It is the sanctioned clean option. But what would you do if the world came for your son and the house of the man who built a fortress answered with doors instead of bullets?" Elena did not answer. She unplugged the tablet and looked out toward the garden where the sky had gone brittle and cold. She knew Salvatore's history, his ways of making decisions that were as lethal as they were considered. She also knew that the man had never been given the experience of softness. He had been raised on laws that required strict repayment and a ledger that did not accept kindness as currency. She had seen his eyes on the summit floor when he had deferred to men younger and hungrier, a flicker of something like boredom followed by the cold geometry of patience. The child was changing the equation, and for someone like Elena, who handled secrets for a living, anything that changed equations without permission was, at least, interesting. The first tug of curiosity was pragmatic. Elena ran a sweep by night, and the network responded to her fingertips like a trained animal. Her scan picked up anomalies, old nodes reactivated, that particular signature of shell companies reshuffled through air-gapped machines, payments that moved around the ledger like whispers in a cathedral. She traced a trail that crawled under the city and emerged in files labeled in languages she did not use in polite conversation. The faintest breadcrumb was a single encrypted transfer that passed through a series of accounts before dissolving into a fugitive trust. She followed the breadcrumb to the villa because she could, and because in the early hours she believed the house was empty. When she found the woman and the child and a battered case file that matched hints she had been following for weeks, she did not merely feel vindicated. She felt torn. The woman had the look of someone who had misjudged the size of the enemy. She had that rare and human combination of courage and despair. Elena had never allowed herself much of either. She was more likely to design a countermeasure than to sit with another human and weigh pity. Yet the way Lucia clutched those documents, like a relic she had no right to, stirred an ache that had nothing to do with loyalty to Salvatore and everything to do with the long, small acts of defiance she saw in people who tried to make wrongs right without permission. "You shouldn't have risked everything," Salvatore said that night when the conversation moved from the practical to the dangerous, from whether they would stay to whether she had seen names that mattered. Matteo slept in a small cot Elena had produced from a storage room. His presence in any formal ledger would complicate things. "Who sent you? Who helped you escape?" She shook her head. "No one helped. I ran. I sold everything I could, my car, some jewelry my fiancé gave me." Her voice tightened when she said the last word. "I know Marco's hand in this. I know there are signatures that point to your network. I didn't choose this. It chose me because I was careless and in love and believed in contracts until they lied." Salvatore listened in silence, the house a breathing thing around them. He believed in contracts as well, not written ones usually, but the unwritten codes that ran like arteries through his world. His instinct was to sift truth from story, to test Lucia's tale against the files she kept. He asked for the copy of the documents, and she produced them like a guilty child presenting contraband. The battered binder had a spine half repaired with tape. It smelled faintly of cigarettes and lemon. Between pages there were annotations in her handwriting, small, furious margins that had once argued with men who had thought themselves clever. Elena watched the exchange like someone reading an unfamiliar romance, interested, skeptical, moved. She scanned the documents under her breath the way a pianist tests keys, with fingers that made private, precise sounds. What she found tangled her loyalties. There were indeed transactions that moved through shell companies that, when layered with other traffic, released funds to accounts tied to projects Salvatore's people had quietly inherited. Nothing screamed, at first glance, of direct command from Salvatore. The longering routes were elegant, purposefully designed to be noble in appearance. But there were serial numbers, email handles, and pattern markers that bore a signature, an algorithmic fingerprint that belonged to a particular lawyer who had once worked publicly to destroy clients by exposing them. Elena recognized the architecture. It was the sort of criminal efficiency that had made Salvatore's empire difficult to dismantle, plausible deniability wrapped in legal muscle. The evening wore into a night of fragile coalitions. Lucia insisted that she could not stay forever. She wanted to get the documents into a prosecutor's hands and then disappear. Salvatore asked the practical questions. Who knew she had the files now? Who might come for them? Who was the younger CEO she had named as her ex? She answered in fragments, the pieces forming a portrait of betrayal. Marco Rivera, a rising tech CEO who had once loved her, had been eager to grow fast and cleanly. He had the sort of charisma that could sanitize sins with speeches and philanthropy. By the time she realized she had been moving money for him, it was too late. He was above scandal. He was, nevertheless, a node in a larger web. "You brought his name to this table?" Elena said. "He is not insignificant." "No," Lucia coughed, then bent her head as if to hide a laugh that had been carved out of terror. "He is everything. He built a foundation. He spoke to ministers and wrote white papers. He is the nicest monster you will ever meet." Silence gathered, like a storm cloud manifesto. Matteo stirred in his sleep and mouthed some syllable in dream-speak that made Salvatore's chest ache again. He had not had a son. He had had demands, assassinations, loyalty called for in the quiet of night, but not this soft, gnawing need. He closed his eyes and made a decision that felt less like an order and more like a choice one made when one saw the world as it could be rather than as it had been shaped. "She stays," he said, and the finality in his voice was like the snap of a gavel. Elena's eyebrows rose. She had prepared for extraction, for negotiation, perhaps even for blood. She had not prepared for such an obvious act of mercy. "If they find you here," she said, "it will be a vulnerability." "It will be," Salvatore agreed. "But what you think of as vulnerability, I will make into a thing that requires explanation. They will not expect me to protect the weak for moral reasons. They will expect me to protect them because it strengthens the house. You can find leverage in that." Lucia watched the exchange like someone witnessing a truce, one she had not earned. She nodded, gratitude and suspicion braided together. "I don't want to be a liability." "You will not be," Salvatore said. He allowed a small, dry humor that was more packed than affection. "You will be accounted for." Elena stepped into a different mode then. Analyst, guardian, artisan of risk. "We will sanitize the files," she said, voice clipped and efficient. "We will put copies in safe locations, encrypted in layers. We will obfuscate every trail leading back to this house and to you." Her eyes met Lucia's. "But you must tell me everything. If there is a route to Marco, we trace it. If there is evidence of other players, investors, middlemen, we need names." Lucia did not flinch. She talked through the small hours, a litany of meetings, of initials, of accounts that seemed like magic because no one thought to look where their money hid. She spoke of dates, of people who had smiled in boardrooms and then siphoned funds into projects that never materialized. She told them about Marco's charm, the way he had convinced regulators to accept system audits, the way he had stacked directors with decorated men who knew how to sign away responsibility. As she spoke, Elena made notes on her tablet with a speed that suggested she could remember names and numbers like prayers. The next morning, Salvatore walked the garden where the sea could be heard like a distant clock. The villa looked unchanged but for the presence of life. A little rain had fallen overnight and left the stone dark and clean. He touched the leaves of the olive trees, as if testing whether they meant to keep producing. Outside the gate, a delivery van idled, one of the mundane things his people used to test for surveillance. Elena had ordered a sweep of the external perimeter and found nothing obvious. Inside, however, the villa was now a patchwork of intentions. Lucia had a hand in making the kitchen presentable. Matteo had left marks on the table that would become evidence in a different calendar. He had not slept properly since he returned from the summit. The echoes of other men's voices haunted his decisions, how they would parse his choice. "This is not weakness," he told himself. "This is strategy. It is also something else, tender and dangerous, an expansion of a heart that had been boxed for efficiency." He remembered, briefly and oddly, a woman he had once admired from a distance, a childhood friend whose laughter had been a rare light in an otherwise strict life. He had not known how to keep such light. He had only known how to use it, and that memory made him taste ash. At noon, a message arrived on Elena's secure line, an encrypted packet she opened with a speed that made her hands tremble just a fraction. She called Salvatore into her small office, where monitors glowed like a captive dawn. "It's a probe," she said, "not direct. Someone is testing our perimeters with a server flip. It's amateur, but it's pointed." "From who?" he demanded. She hesitated, then showed him a sentiment that made the room shrink. The probe traced to a consultancy firm with a finger in many pies, a shell company that received funds from Marco Rivera's accounts. It was the kind of amateur move a desperate man made, someone not comfortable with the cold calculus of serious cyber warfare, but wanting to test if the walls would bleed when pressed. "They are looking," Elena said quietly. "They have been watching, measuring. Marco is not directly involved as a handler. He uses intermediaries, But he knows people who know how to push buttons. Salvatore's mind moved faster than his voice. He could have his men trace the probe, smash the consultancy, abduct the intermediary, and squeeze names from him. He could burn all public credibility Marco had like a torch through his empire. He could end the matter with fire. But there was Lucia, and the battered pages in her hand, and the small child asleep in the room above them. He could also use the provocation as a test, see who blinked, who moved, learn the shape of Marco's fear. He liked to learn by pressure. "Elena," he said, the syllable a small command that made her look up. "Prepare a counter. We will not strike first. We will let them reveal what they are afraid of, and then we will decide how to use it." She nodded, understanding the plan that was as much about chess as it was about mercy. "And Lucia?" "We keep her close. We purge anything that can tie back to her." "She doesn't want to be protected because of you," Elena observed. "She wants the justice the system promised." "Justice," Salvatore repeated. The word had a flavor of irony he couldn't hide. He had, in his time, reinterpreted the notion for his world. "We will give her a version of justice, one that ends with change. And if that means we topple a CEO and restructure the flow, so be it." The day wore on as they set small things into motion. Elena created false trails in the villa's network, planted decoy files for anyone who might break in. Lucia cataloged pieces of her case in careful stacks, the edges of paper a neat geography that made Elena smile in approval at the order of it. Matteo drew a sun on a scrap paper and handed it to Salvatore with a small gravity that felt like a benediction. He took it and stored it in his pocket as if it were a license to be softer. And like that softening, for better and worse, the man whose name could end careers had begun to make decisions not strictly in the interest of power. Late evening brought a visitor who did not leave with the sunset. A courier arrived with a sealed envelope, stamped with the insignia of a law firm Salvatore recognized only from seeing its partners dine with the city's most dangerous men. Inside was a simple sentence written with diplomatic cruelty. "We understand you have taken an interest in a matter that concerns several parties. It is in everyone's interest that discretion prevails. Let us know your conditions." The letter was a warning and a request. It assumed Salvatore's complicity while offering a chance to negotiate, which, to his world, was both an insult and an opportunity. He recognized the hand that wrote it, Marco's PR counsel, a man who loved to dress threats as pleasantries. Salvatore burned the paper in the fireplace, watched the real paper curl and die into smoke, then left the ash in the hearth as if to say to the house itself, "Threats are now formal." Lucia felt the pressure like a storm. She began to second-guess her decision to confide in strangers, even those who named themselves protectors. "You must be careful," she told Salvatore one night, her voice a low, tremulous thing. "You don't know what they will do. Men like Marco don't like to lose face." "I don't care if he loses face," Salvatore answered. The bluntness of his words made her look at him anew. "I care if he threatens you and him, the boy. If that happens, I will rearrange his life so that it fits in a smaller, quieter place. I will not allow threats to be made in my name." Elena's eyes were on him, always. She had been the one to lock folders, to reroute servers, to hide physical copies of the documents in places a lawyer would never think to look, like an old wine barrel in the villa's wine cellar. Her methods were deliberate and merciless, and they provided a safety net for a woman who had come in with her truths tucked under her ribs like contraband. In the midst of this fortification, something else occurred. Elena began to teach Lucia about obfuscation, not in the language of criminals, but in practicality. She showed her how to digitize, how to encrypt a file, how to replace names with hashes. Lucia watched her hands move over a keyboard like a pianist learning to play scales, and sometimes when Lucia's fingers trembled, Elena would physically guide them, smallness touching smallness in the dim glow of monitors. The action was intimate in a way neither of them named. They were simply two women repairing a dangerous artifact with the language they knew: duty and craft. In the thick of the night, as they prepared for a storm that might be metaphorical or real, they grew aware of the region watching. Word travels in their world like smoke. A villa that shelters a thief of a CEO's secrets would become a rumor quickly. Rival clans would test well-being, journalists would sniff for scandal, and businessmen would assess whether Salvatore's scissors were duller for his softness. The danger was no longer merely legal, it was symbolic. Salvatore understood this perhaps more than anyone. The idea of a mafia boss who sheltered a woman and her child could be spun into storylines, ballots, and vendettas. He had, in his life, cultivated a reputation for surgical calm. He had enforced codes that made men fall silent. Now, as if by accident or deliberate whim, he had allowed the center to shift. The villa hummed with the sound of people who had no right to fear in his house, but did anyway. The choice was made. The consequences had only begun. They waited like hunted things that had decided, for the time being, to stop running. The morning after the courier, Lucia woke with a dry mouth and the memory of the envelope like a bruise under her ribs. She moved quietly through the villa as if her feet might betray her. Matteo sat cross-legged on the flagstones of the kitchen, lining up his crayons in an order Salvatore would later call a strategic array. He looked up when she appeared and offered her a minty smile that made the absurdity of the world feel momentarily pardonable. Lucia sat and breathed him in, this small, miraculous proof that she had been brave enough to run. Outside, the landscape had the flat, honest light of winter. The sea, with its patient murmuring, kept an old-time clock on them. Distant fishing boats made pale scratches out on the water. The villa's shutters had been closed for so long that the light that came through the slats looked woolly. Elena had posted a man at the gate with orders that spoke in the short language of contingency. She had also, quietly and without fanfare, planted a camera behind a fig tree in the garden. It watched the winding country road like an unblinking eye. The camera did what it was meant to do within hours. A single van came down the lane at an unhurried pace and slowed across the road as if a GPS had taught it the etiquette of hesitation. It bore no insignia, but the driver looked like someone who had learned to look at the world with suspicion instead of wonder. Elena watched the feed and rewound it 3 times before she lifted a hand in a small private sign that said, "Yes, they are here." "They're not amateurs," she told Salvatore without looking away from the screen. Someone sent them with a job sheet and a deadline. They were told where to test. Salvatore walked toward the screen, the habit of command hanging on him like a coat. He saw the van with its blandness, the way one of the men, tall with a cap pulled down, scanned the perimeter and checked his phone. He read the coordinates written into the way the man moved. Not a hit, not a surveillance for the sake of curiosity, but a probe meant to open a breach if found time enough. The calculus of risk reasserted itself like an old tutor. "Containment," he said. His voice was a blade wrapped in velvet. Elena nodded and began to deploy measures with the fluid, practiced motion of someone who had long ago learned how to hide the truth without lying. She pushed false packets into the villa's visible network, baited a few convincing decoys, and seeded digital breadcrumbs that looked big and vulnerable, an invitation to less careful hands. Lucia watched from the doorway, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. The house where she had, by mistake or grace, taken refuge had become an instrument in a conversation she had only just learned the language of. She realized with a panic that left her fingers cold that she had no control over how this story would be told out in the world. It was like being the subject of an accusation and yet not having the craft to defend oneself in court. She asked herself, with the terrible clarity of someone pressed to the edge of morality, whom she could trust. "You've put me in the middle of a war I never knew existed," she said to Salvatore that afternoon in the library, the walls heavy with books and memory. "And you put us in the middle of something you thought would end your life," Salvatore answered. There was no sweetness in it. He looked tired in a way that ruined him, made him human. "We will do what is necessary." "It won't make it right," she whispered. "Perhaps not," he conceded. "But right is sometimes a matter of rearranging who has power and who does not, and I have a talent for rearrangement." On the third night after the van, when the world turned itself into shadow and the villa breathed in cold air and the glow of monitors, the men at the gate acted. They came without the brazen confidence of attackers. Instead, they moved like men who had rehearsed the narrative of being lost. One of them, a gaunt-faced man with an ink-stained palm, came to the door under the pretense of asking for directions. Salvatore allowed him to be admitted because he liked to see the shape of intruders up close. He met the man in the courtyard, where moonlight softened the edges of suspicion. "You shouldn't be here," Salvatore said pleasantly, the way one warns a sleeping dog before it bites. The man smiled in a way that tried to be disarming and failed. "We're lost," the man said. His voice had the careful looseness of someone rehearsed by a handler. "Broken down vehicle. Need to use a phone." "Outside," Salvatore said. He turned to the gate and gave the smallest flick of his hand. Two of his men closed in quietly behind the visitor. It was a theater piece, a false opening to let real intent be seen. The man did not try to run. He had been trained not to, or told that running would complicate his existence in ways he did not want. Elena, watching from upstairs on a live feed, tapped out commands that traced back the man's phone to a specific triangulation. The scent of a trap tightened. They took him to the business room, Salvatore's version of a cage that preferred to keep a polite conversation. He had his men spread out, but they kept distance. He wanted this to be an extraction that told them what they intended to know without introducing the temptation of brute force. "Who sent you?" Salvatore asked without preamble. The man was slick with fear. Under the white of his eyes, there was the steady calculation of a professional who knew his options were narrowing. He said names as if the syllables were small currency he could spend to buy a less painful end. "Consultancy," he said, and he paused and swallowed. "Rivera's people." Elena's jaw clenched imperceptibly. Salvatore's gaze sharpened. "Who in Rivera's people?" he asked. "Middle management, finance, a fixer, Giorgio. He handles dirty work," the man offered. He spoke of names like someone shedding a cloak. "Why are you here?" Lucia asked then, her voice small but steel-edged. The presence of a woman who had been in the room suddenly animated the interrogation, rearranged who could ask questions and expect answers. The man looked at her like a man who had found an unexpected lighthouse. "To test alarms," he blurted, "to see if the villa had been compromised, to see if it was safe to move assets. They were told Rivera needs confirmation. If you have material here, he needs to be warned." Salvatore listened. He let the words hang like laundry. You could always tell when a man was lying. The economy of breath, the tiny hitch at the end of a sentence. He saw the man's hands clench. He felt the tangle of power around Rivera, the way that man clothed threats in help. More and more, he felt the net tightening around a CEO who had thought himself a whisper above consequence. "Who told you this?" Salvatore asked. The question was less about the man and more about a higher actor. The man hesitated. He spat out a name that made Lucia inhale sharply. Marco Rivera's counsel, the one who writes soft letters. The revelation made the room spin out in new trajectories. Salvatore's fists tightened behind his back. Elena exhaled and, with the flat efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this, started to interrogate the man about timelines and technological signatures. Lucia watched from the edge of the room, her heart making its own decisions in favor of the boy upstairs. She had come looking for justice and had found instead a labyrinth of men who measured everything in leverage. They kept the man, long enough to strip him of any pretense of neutrality, long enough to keep Rivera's fixers guessing, but not long enough to fantasize about collateral damage. Salvatore let him go with a warning he knew would travel, a broken watch and a note tucked into his pocket that said simply, "We watch. Leave our name out of your offers." When the man left, the villa descended into a kind of exhausted silence. The crew of protectors exhaled in small measures. Elena cleaned the digital traces with the relish of someone who had disassembled and reassembled the same clock 100 times. Lucia sat at the kitchen table and watched the boy draw with a concentration that made his face look old and very young at the same time. Matteo drew a crooked house and a sun, and Lucia traced the lines with a finger as if she could press everything correct with petroleum and forgiveness. That night, after the man left and they had stacked their defenses like stones in a dam, Marco Rivera made a move that was as public as it was cunning. A tech conference that week featured Rivera as a keynote speaker, and in front of cameras and microphones, before a crowd of investors and journalists who thought they were seeing a man who had outgrown scandal, he announced a new charity initiative aimed at cleaning digital markets of corrupt flows. He spoke of transparency as a virtue, as if the very mention of the word could absolve him of uncertainty. On a small screen in Salvatore's office, the speech played like a lie becoming a gospel. Salvatore watched Rivera smile and fold his hands and offer the world a future cleaned by speeches. He had never liked Rivera's face in public because it was engineered to be loved. It was the face of a man who planned to be thought above reproach. Lucia watched the speech in a space she had not planned to inhabit. Newsroom footage played in a corner of the villa, picked up off a private feed Elena had scraped. As Rivera spoke, Lucia felt her stomach contract. She had lived inside the sound of his voice when it had whispered promise to her. It had once been the sound of home. Now it was the sound of a predator making the world believe he was benevolent. She felt sick and small and furious, an odd blend that had powered her through months of hiding. "You can't let him win the narrative," Elena said, softly, leaning back in her chair. "If Rivera tells the story, he erases the evidence. If he cleans the conversation with philanthropy, people will stop listening." Salvatore nodded. His response was practical and cold and oddly tender. "We will make sure the story he tells has holes big enough for people to fall through." Lucia looked between them, between the man who had given her shelter and the woman who had wrapped that shelter in armor. Their faces, in the dim room, were lit not by heroics but by the hard fire of consequence. She understood then that regardless of how the next moves played, regardless if Rivera's PR pulse beat louder than her truth, she had not made a mistake by coming here. She had, perhaps, stumbled into a different kind of armor. The villa held its breath with them. Outside, unseen hands moved. Rivera's people recalibrated, journalists sharpened questions, and rival factions in the region felt the chance to poke and test a supposedly invulnerable fortress. As the night deepened and the sea kept its patient minutes, the three of them, Lucia with her file, Elena with her code, and Salvatore with his ledger of favors, felt the first real crack open. Not one that promised immediate collapse, but one that would expose old gears and new failures. Trust, once fractured, was a dangerous thing. It could be rebuilt, but only if someone chose to rip away the plaster and work on the bones. In the quiet that followed the night's maneuvers, it was clear that the villa's bones would be tested. Old alliances would strain under the pressure of reputations and the need for survival. New ones would be forged in the heat of common peril. Secrets already hummed under the floorboards. Fractures were forming like spider veins beneath ice. They had passed through a threshold. The rest of the region, men who measured power by the sharpness of their edges, would watch and react. Salvatore had chosen, and the choice had split him from the only identity he had carried without doubt. In doing so, he had allowed the possibility that his empire might hinge on something other than fear. That possibility made him vulnerable in ways that invited both tenderness and assault. The next move, when it came, would not be subtle. It would be loud enough to ensure everyone knew the game had changed. And when the game changed, loyalties would be tested, betrayals would surface like oil, and the fragile bonds between a mafia boss, a refugee mother, and a hacker would either hold under the strain or break with catastrophic intimate noise. The courtyard smelled like rain-damp stone and oil, the sense of the world Salvatore had made and the softer life he was learning to harbor. The intrusion at the gate had been a bone thrown to test teeth, and the man with the inked palm had left with a watch stopped at the wrong hour and a message in his pocket that would spread like a whisper through ears he trusted. For a moment after he left, the villa settled into a strange, nervous lull, as if it had been allowed to breathe only because it had convinced the pursuers it still slept. Salvatore stood at the library window watching Matteo play with a wooden car, watching the child push it along a line of salt where light caught and turned to dust. The scene should have been banal, and instead it folded into his chest like a small, exquisite pain. He had never wanted a child, and now, with brutal clarity, he could not imagine what he would be if he lost one. The thought of a van coming down the lane because someone decided to correct a narrative with violence made him feel suddenly old and arrogant and foolish. He had built a world around leverage, but there were things no ledger could defend. Tenderness, as it turned out, required different instruments. Elena moved like a shadow with purpose. She set traps that had nothing to do with bullets, fake files, plausible leaks, honey traps of data that would make any aggressive probe think it had found a seam worth ripping. She also deployed people in the media, carefully placed whispers to make Rivera's PR firm twitch. She worked the dark like an artist, cutting and patching truths so they bent toward a new shape, one where Lucia's evidence could surface without being discredited by a charismatic CEO polishing his halo. Lucia watched them both, feeling the weight of the battered files like a live thing against her skin. She had expected to be hid. She had not expected to be defended. The gratitude she felt was sharp enough to hurt. Each time she tried to speak of taking the documents to prosecutors, Salvatore steered her towards strategy rather than idealism. "The law we aspire to is different from the law that will save you tonight," he told her once, and there was no didactic edge in his voice, only the tired certainty of someone who had seen the machine and knew where to clog its gears. They were building toward a kind of rescue that would be surgical. Discredit Rivera's public virtue, reveal the laundering route without endangering Lucia or Matteo, and force the men who had profited to choose exposure over their comfortable silence. It was aggressive charity, and it unnerved everyone who believed charity must be meek. On the third night after the van, while a storm gathered at sea like a threat with a polished hat, Salvatore called a meeting. They gathered in the glass dining room where the sea threw silver on the table and made the world look like a film strip. Elena briefed him on the plan. A public leak to a journalist who owed her a favor, timed to coincide with a dossier that would look like an accidental discovery, a USB left in a cafe, a file attached to an email thread that would circulate before anyone could contain it. The leak would point to middlemen, not to the villa, and it would frame Rivera as an unwitting beneficiary rather than the solitary villain. Lucia would remain anonymous. The evidence would speak in its own steady tongue. "It's risky," Elena said. "If Rivera suspects us, he'll move everything offshore and appoint new shells. He'll bury the paper trail. We need to apply pressure now, before his PR machine rewrites him." Lucia's hands trembled on the edge of the table. "What if they come after us first?" she asked. Her voice held a childish fear that made Salvatore turn a little softer. Less calculation, more protectiveness. "They might," Salvatore said. "But fear is not a strategy. We will act in ways that protect you first. Then we will remove Rivera's capacity to leverage his reputation." There was an unexpected tenderness in his voice when he said us. Elena, listening, realized the subtle shift she had been scanning for in his expression had solidified into ownership, not of people as assets, but of their fates as commitments. The acknowledgement unsettled her, making her both furious and oddly buoyant. A man so accustomed to owning leverage could claim loyalty and perhaps mean it. They set the plan into motion by dawn. Elena created a phantom persona whose digital footprints led to a coffee shop in the city. She seeded it with innocuous posts, and then, when the world turned from night to noise, she slipped into networks a carefully curated file. It portrayed the transfers stripped of personal identifiers, but annotated with timestamps that matched Lucia's notes. The timestamps were the key. They stitched together a timeline that screamed the laundering pattern if anyone cared to look closely. Elena included just enough breadcrumbs to make the trail irresistible to a journalist who loved scandal and had a reputation for brutal accuracy. The journalist, Mariana Costa, known for the way she broke figures down into human failures, received the file as the sun lifted its first pale coin. She called in a favor, arranged a meeting in a studio that smelled of coffee and cheap bulbs, and read the dossier with a hunger that was professional and human all at once. When the story published that afternoon, the headline was Elegant Cruelty. New evidence ties Rivera's foundation to questionable transfers. The article read like a surgeon's precise incision, exposing arteries that promised to bleed truth if not staunched. Rivera's response was practiced and outrageously sympathetic. He announced immediate internal audits, donations redirected to enhance transparency, and a willingness to cooperate with authorities. The PR dance was well choreographed, but a ripple had been set in motion that they could not entirely control. Investors' nerves flickered. A minor board member resigned on camera. A senator requested a briefing. Rivera's smile cracked just once when a firebrand in an online forum began to pull thread after thread from the dossier. The narrative no longer belonged solely to him. When Rivera sent a message, courteous, thinly veiled as concern, Salvatore read it and burned it slowly. Elena traced a hinterland of panic in his team. They were rearranging assets, contacting friendly regulators, and whispering to journalists who might be persuaded. The man who had thought himself a public saint was beginning to sweat. That night, the villa felt like a crucible. Matteo had been coaxed into bed with a story about a heroic boat that rescued an entire island. Lucia lay awake, the adrenaline of the day making her fingers tingle. She felt as if she had been pushed into a river that ran faster than she could swim, but at least now she swam with a raft. Salvatore's men, Elena's networks, the journalist's tenacity. It was an unlikely coalition, formed from necessity and a fragile trust. Elena's voice in Salvatore's ear, sharp, excited, terrified. "They took the bait," she said. "Rivera's team redirected a transfer. He panicked." "Where to?" Salvatore asked. Elena's reply was quick and precise. "A shell in the Caymans. They thought their route would be safe." Salvatore's response was immediate. "We go now." He moved with the speed of someone who had learned how to convert a thought into movement. They left the villa in darkness, a convoy that smelled of diesel and resolve. Lucia wrapped herself in a coat and held Matteo tight, the boy's breath against her collar, a small, steady drum. She had not believed courage could be taught in the way Elena had taught her encryption, or in the way Salvatore taught strategy, by making a move and accepting every possible consequence. She had learned to fight by being protected and by being asked to take a role in the fight. In the city, lights blurred into a ribbon as they pursued a route that sniffed of greed and new corners of jurisdiction. Elena worked the net, her fingers a blur on a tablet, peeling back digital carpets to reveal the path Rivera's people had chosen. Salvatore drove with a silence that was a kind of prayer. Lucia curled in the back seat, watching a man she barely knew become a guardian in a language she recognized: action. They reached an offshore mailbox, the kind of legal fiction where men hid money behind paperwork and lawyers with clean hands. Salvatore's entrance into that space was a kind of confession and a claim. He would force the opener, not with violence, but with leverage he would make public if pushed. Elena had arranged for a thin line of legal pressure to be applied: an anonymous tip, a private investigator with moral flexibility, a set of emails surfaced on a platform that liked exposing the rich. They would not storm offices, they would reveal them. When the documents surfaced on a secure server, Rivera's men realized the hand he had relied upon to polish his image had oil on its cuffs. Panic moved through his inner circle like a contagion. Investors started to be coy. Auditors requested time. The public, always hungry for scandal, took the story and reframed it in little self-righteous pages. Rivera's polished smile flickered between outrage and damage control. He called press conferences, insisted on transparency, and tried to charm his way out of ruin. But the damage was surgical. The leaked documents contained an algorithmic signature Elena had found, one that connected the flow of money directly to the consultancy that had probed the villa. The signature was a breadcrumb left by a person who had once been sloppy and now paid the price. The public trail led to middlemen. The middlemen, under pressure, produced names. The net shrank. Rivera's haven of plausible deniability began to leak. When the regulators finally turned their faces and asked questions, the weight of proof and public pressure forced a cascade of resignations. Rivera, in his last public-facing hour, looked like a man who had been unmasked as mortal and messy. He announced steps to cooperate fully. In private, his counsel tried to negotiate the shape of surrender. But Salvatore had never been content with half measures. He wanted not only restitution, but a reconfiguration that would make future predation harder. He sent Rivera an offer through channels that would not be recorded. Return the funds disgorged into a foundation supervised by a coalition of civil society actors. Place key players under compliance enforced by third parties. And publicly acknowledge wrongdoing in a way that made it harder to regain pristine reputation. In return, Salvatore promised to let legal systems do their work, but he insisted on immortality's peculiar luxury, that this version of justice be visible, painful, and transformative. Rivera balked. Salvatore made it clear he would make the leaks deeper and the exposure louder. Rivera chose pragmatism. The cost of fighting publicly would be greater than the surrender. He agreed to a settlement that left him lesser in the public eye and his men scattered into quieter lives. The region watched, the air thick with gossip and speculation. Salvatore had used the very tools he once deployed to hide sins: networks, leverage, intimidation, in a new configuration, to force a man of soft words to pay in full. When the dust settled, there was an odd quiet in the villa. The pressure had not vanished. There would be calls, legal procedures, and a slow, bureaucratic unweaving of old threads. But for the first time in months, Lucia slept more than an hour at a stretch. Matteo drew boats on paper and handed them out, a raft for each person who had helped him find safety. Salvatore put one by his plate, and later, when no one watched, he traced a finger over the child's careless lines, feeling something like reverence. Elena stood outside the kitchen watching the two of them, woman and child, together. She had been the architect of the leak and the quiet fury that protected them. She had done the unglamorous work of creating scaffolding for other people's courage. The act of protection had left a mark on her that was not easily named. She found herself wanting to inhabit the space between Salvatore's command and Lucia's softer defiance, a strange geography that required her to trust the man she had always read and the woman she had come to need. Salvatore sought them both in the garden when the sun broke the next morning. He brought them nothing but words that were new and awkward and true. "You will not be trophies of this house," he told Lucia. "You will be accounted for, yes, but as equals where it matters. You will have safety, and you will have a voice." He looked at Elena then, and the air seemed to accept that a new compact was forming among them, one that would ask sacrifice and offer a different kind of sovereignty. "I will stand between the world and your life," he said quietly, "but in return, you will allow me to learn how to be more than a ledger." Lucia's eyes shimmered. Elena's face folded into a shape that was almost a smile. Salvatore, who had built an empire on cold calculations, found himself making an offer of himself as penance, promises that carried the cost of reputation and risk. It was the beginning of a redemption neither had asked for, but both seemed to need. They had won a battle that reconfigured power. They had not erased the past, nor could they, but in the slow morning after, in the messy domesticity of a villa warmed by a small child's presence and guarded by a man who once brokered betrayals, something tender and dangerous had taken root. Sacrifice had been paid, by threats met, reputations challenged, comfort dismantled. The claim had been made. This household would stand together and defend what had been given new life. Morning came brittle and honest, and the villa held its small, improbable peace. Salvatore watched Matteo set a row of tiny boats along the windowsill, each crooked hull a tiny proof that life could be simple and defiant at once. The settlement had done more than bruise reputations. It had bought them time, and time had become a currency Salvatore had never valued until now. He walked the gardens with Elena and Lucia at his side, the three of them forming an odd private procession through olive trees that smelled of salt and rain. Words came slowly at first, then with the ease of people who had survived storms. "We will steward this," Salvatore said, voice both promise and command. "The files will be placed where they cannot be used to harm innocents. Rivera will be kept honest by more than lawyers, by visibility and the slow, awkward work of compliance." Lucia nodded, fingers curled around a thermos she had learned to carry like armor. "I want prosecutions to happen," she said, "not vendettas. I want the families who lost money to see restitution, to know the line of accountability is visible." Her eyes flicked to Elena. The hacker's face was unreadable, then warm. Elena had become, in the weeks of danger, less of an instrument and more of an ally. She had taught Lucia to encrypt without teaching her to hide. She had taught Salvatore to open channels without eroding his edges. They agreed on a plan that stitched together public pressure, legal oversight, and charitable restructuring. Elena would continue to feed journalists with verified documents at a pace that would suffocate PR spin. Mariana's articles would be precise scalpel strokes. Civic groups would monitor compliance. Salvatore would apply pressure where regulators stalled, using influence to ensure audits were real and enforced. Lucia would be the voice that chose to speak in measured terms, her testimony bathed in corroborated evidence rather than spectacle. As the region watched, the narrative shifted. A CEO humbled, a boss who had shielded a refugee family. Controversy softened into a harder truth about power. Men who measured strength by impulse learned that restraint could be engineered. Salvatore found his name mentioned not in whispers of fear, but in puzzled, sometimes admiring commentary about unexpected charity that carried teeth. Elena, who had once read him only as code, began reading him as a man willing to be remade. Days folded into months. Rivera's foundation was reconstituted under oversight. Middlemen took plea deals. Some careers collapsed and rebuilt in smaller, bleaker places. Lucia met with prosecutors and civil advocates. Her testimony helped secure settlements that funded services for communities damaged by laundering and predatory ventures. Matteo learned to name new friends and trusted guards as men who were not threats but protectors. He taught Salvatore how to knot a small sail. Salvatore taught him how to stand still and observe. At night, the villa glowed softly. Elena and Lucia would sit by the kitchen table and trade stories in the way women do when danger has finished teaching them who can be trusted. Salvatore would linger in doorway shadows, then step in with awkward humor and an offer to fix the plumbing or trim the hedges, small tasks that were gestures of belonging. In the end, the region did what regions do. It adapted. Power rebalanced, not erased. The villa remained a place of whisper and watchfulness, but it had acquired laughter that was not brittle and a table that held mismatched plates without ceremony. Salvatore learned to keep a lighter ledger. Favors still existed, but they were sometimes paid in meals and bedtime stories, in school books for Matteo, in legal clinics funded by disgorged funds. On a late afternoon, Matteo ran from the garden toward the shore, red kite bobbing like a stubborn promise. Salvatore followed, slower, eyes on the boy who had become a reckoning. Elena walked beside Lucia, hands occasionally brushing, a small contact that needed no label. The three adults watched the child lift the kite into a wind that felt like forgiveness. The villa, once a fortress of silence, exhaled into a life that was risk-etched and resilient. Their new normal was not comfortable, but it was true. Power wielded with care could, improbably, make room for love.